Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to be talking about the A&E biography, Lex Luger. It was tremendous. And a special little treat, I actually did my job this week. And I read a bit of Lex Luger's book. So I'm going to be able to flesh out some of the things that were not really all that discussed in the documentary. But the documentary itself was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. So the documentary did a little bit of talking about his backstory, which, they kind of breezed through it, which I was really glad they did. They talked to some coaches and different people like that was involved with Lex playing football. That's all really cool. That part was fun. He goes into a little bit more detail in the book, especially about his him getting kicked out of college, or getting suspended from the football team. This led to him going to the CFL, then a short stint in the NFL where he was on the injured reserve squad for the Green Bay Packers, and then ultimately playing for the USFL. And then we finally get to him getting into wrestling. And that's really what I want to spend a lot of time on. And this is kind of where, even though I did read about his growing up, it was very interesting. We're here because we're wrestling fans. So let's talk about the wrestling. Now, they did a good job of showing all the training videos in the biography of all the really hard workouts he had to do under Hiro Matsuda. So I want to read a little bit of a passage about him going to get into wrestling. So Lex writes in his book in chapter 6, "My grandfather, Stanley Pole, loved professional wrestling. When I was a kid running around my cousins and grandparents' house in Buffalo on a Saturday night, we'd dart past Grandpa Pole sitting in his favorite chair, his eyes riveted on the weekly matchups on the black and white television. Sometimes I'd pause momentarily to see what was so captivating, but it didn't grab my attention, so I'd dash off to play." So this is his full experience with wrestling right there. He never really watched it as a kid. So he goes into championship wrestling from Florida and knowing only about WrestleMania, really. So he says, quote, he goes to talk to a guy and says that, "Hey, I'm Larry Pole. I'm a professional football player, but I'm looking at some off-season work. I've been seeing and hearing a lot about WrestleMania, but I don't know much about the pro wrestling industry or how you get into it. Is there someone I could talk to about a possible career option?" This guy walked into a wrestling company and said, "Hey, you guys get some career options? I'm working off season here." So he was told to go talk to Hiro Matsuda, and it's a name that kind of rung a bell with him because Hiro Matsuda had trained Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Hulk Hogan. So he says, quote, "Matsuda owned a garment factory in Tampa, and we met in his office there. When I entered the room, he stood up and extended his hand. His grip was strong. He was smaller than I was, but large for a Japanese man at 6'1", 215. His perfect tan set off the jet black hair and bright smile. His teeth were such a brilliant white that I swear a person could be read by them. Matsuda gestured for me to take a seat. He asked me for my background and a couple of questions about football. He says, 'So do you have a wrestling school?' I asked politely, still trying to figure him out. I knew he was a former pro wrestler. I later learned he was an expert in the martial arts and that his training was legendary and fierce. It was rumored that he would snap the bones of his students if he thought they weren't taking the training seriously. No, I don't have a school, but I do train wrestlers." Now, the story about him breaking bones is, of course, a Hulk Hogan favorite. It's one thing that Hulk Hogan claims that happened to him is that Hiro Matsuda broke his leg because he wasn't taking things seriously. So he talks a little bit about the training. He says, "I always prided myself on my disciplined approach to workouts. But as I would find out, Matsuda's method for training was in a class all its own. Before I was allowed to even imagine being in a ring, before a single wrestling move was demonstrated, I had to master Matsuda's legendary regimen and pass the final exam he had created. It was his way of weeding out those who weren't truly dedicated. To him, it was a matter of honor and respect for the sport. Matsuda was protective of his profession and only wanted the best of the best to represent what he loved. So he says, quote, "The very first day, Matsuda was intense and precise like a machine. That appealed to my own work ethic. Our one-on-one sessions always began with a 5-mile run in the late afternoon or early evening. When the South Florida heat and humidity were so stifling, you could hardly breathe. That was all part of the plan. I was 27 and Matsuda had another 20 years on me, but he did everything he asked me to do. When we got back to the factory, drenched in sweat, there was no cool down. Actually, there was no air conditioning, no wrestling pads, no carpet, nothing, but the bare concrete floor, where the clothes racks had been pushed aside to form an area approximating the size of a wrestling ring. The lighting was dim, cast from a single light bulb hanging above us, and a faint glow from Matsuda's office. It was eerily quiet. The real work was about to begin." And so he's going to talk a little bit more about the training and how terrible it was. He says, quote, 10 sets of 30 push-ups. After I did 30, Matsuda would nudge me out of the way to do 30. We alternate until we reached 300. Matsuda counted, but he only counted the ones done correctly. Your chest had to touch the floor. The goal was 10 minutes or less, 2 push-ups per second. I really felt it in the first 2 weeks. I could barely lift my arms, but my body quickly adapted. The 5-mile run and the push-ups constituted the pre-training workup. There were many guys who never made it past the warm-up stage, and I would take them nearly a year to do so. The push-ups were followed by one of Matsuda's favorites, Hindu squats. Hindu squats work all the muscles in your legs, quads, hamstrings, and calves, as well as your hips, lower back, and lungs. When you maintain correct form and combine the movements with deep breathing, this exercise builds overall body strength and gives you incredibly strong legs with explosive power. The great Indian wrestler Gama used Hindu squats to develop tree trunk thighs that gave him overwhelming dominance over his opponents. So he kept being pushed and being pushed. And he ended up doing all sorts of mental gymnastics to force himself through this. And it's tremendous when you read about the kind of training regimen these older guys went through. And this was serious. There was nobody for them to tattletale to. Because nobody wanted to hear that you couldn't make it through training. He goes through the training, and now he's backstage, championship wrestling from Florida. He's about to go on. And all these guys are in the room talking about him. And this is a very interesting passage I want to read. He says, quote, "Everyone was talking about me as if I wasn't in the room. Matsuda, Wahoo McDaniel, and Blackjack Mulligan, among others, were tossing out a few names. None of them seemed to click with the bookers. Still, I was following Matsuda's advice to sit quietly, watch, listen, and learn. But time was getting short. It was only minutes before the scheduled taping. I raised my hand and broke silence. I have a suggestion for a name. They looked at me as if an alien had just landed in their midst. All right, kid, let's hear it. Lex Luger. One of my favorite television shows at the time was Magnum P.I. with Tom Selleck. I had looked up to Magnum in the encyclopedia. I looked up Magnum in encyclopedia, which led me to research guns. TV's Magnum carried a semi-automatic pistol. I thought, in honor of my German heritage, a Luger would be more apropos. It's easy to guess where Lex comes from. An homage to my favorite superhero, Superman, who battled his villainous archenemy, Lex Luthor." And he kind of tells this story in Biography, too, that he got his name for Lex Luthor and the German Luger. But he, of course, didn't mention being German in the documentary, but it's not like anything would have changed too much, would it? I mean, guy can't help that he was German, right? So they also talked about, they didn't talk about this here, about why he was billed from Chicago. And basically the long and the short of it is that they thought Buffalo was too small of a town to book a guy from. So they said, oh, well, they're going to book you from a big city. So they picked Chicago because it's kind of out of nowhere. It wasn't mentioned in the biography, but it should be said that he was actually using steroids before he got into wrestling. So he used to cycle, and he learned from Rick Rude in Championship Wrestling from Florida, I believe it was, the 8-week on, 8-week off cycle. That's when you take steroids for 8 weeks and then you do 8 weeks off of steroids. But he was doing steroids before he got into pro wrestling. So steroids wasn't mentioned as much in the biography as you would think, to be quite honest. So his popularity is rising in Championship Wrestling from Florida, and he was doing okay. Ron Simmons in the biography gave him so much credit, saying that Lex Luger was one of his guys who got him into the business. I think they actually played against each other in college, as he said. And Jim Cornette actually made an appearance here, which is very good. He said that Lex Luger had the physique, but he didn't have the knowledge, but he was still being pushed to the top. This will be 1985. So Luger writes in his book, quote, "As my popularity began to rise, my salary increased to a main event level, about 1,000 to 1,500 per week. I was beginning to be noticed outside of Florida, too, by various NWA rivals, including Jim Crockett Promotions of Charlotte, North Carolina. When one of the Crockett stars, NWA World Champion Ric Flair, come to Tampa for a series of regional matches. I was one of the several wrestlers over several nights scheduled in the ring." Now, they kind of skipped over the whole thing with him and Bruiser Brody, where Bruiser Brody was essentially just being a bully and refused to participate this whole time that they were in a cage match, I think it was, in Florida. He scared the tar out of Luger, and Luger ran away. They kind of left that part out. Even Luger doesn't talk about that in here. But it was an interesting little piece of business I decided to throw in there. Just because, I mean, how could you not know that? But there is something else in here that I thought was very interesting, too. Is in this book, Lex Luger is not shy about how much he didn't know about wrestling. And he wasn't really all that shy in the biography either about how much he didn't know about wrestling. So he doesn't know what wrestling terms mean. He hears the words babyface and heel the first time when they were picking whether he was going to be a babyface or a heel. So the first time he ever hears the word Broadway is when he's going to wrestle Ric Flair for an hour. That's the first time he's ever heard the term. He says, quote, "We were slated for a Broadway, a time limit draw, in this case an hour-long match. I learned what the plan was just minutes before I left the locker room. An hour-long match? The longest I had been in the ring prior to this had been 10 or 11 minutes, max. I was nervous and a little worried. In the midst of the match, Flair told me to use a sunset flip on him. A sunset flip? Even though it was one of the most basic moves in the sport, I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. There was a momentary look of disbelief on his face, then he got to work. For the next hour, Flair carried me. But here's the thing about Ric Flair. No matter what an opponent's skill level, he can make a guy look like $1 million. He was that proficient. So he's, at this point, even in the book, just talking about how he just didn't know anything. And he was just kind of, he looked good, and people just kept pushing him because he looked great. So, of course, they talk about his run in the Four Horsemen, which came after Flair suggested, or in the documentary, Flair claims that he suggested Lex Luger to Jim Crockett when he went back to Jim Crockett, and Luger was brought in to join the Four Horsemen. Now, at the time when he first started at Jim Crockett Promotions, he was still working at Championship Wrestling from Florida. So he was doing basically 2-a-days. He would go to Atlanta for the TV tapings and WCW, and then he would fly back to Florida. Then, of course, he says about the Four Horsemen. He says, "It wasn't long before I became part of the story, brought into the fold as an associate, with Rick making my on-screen introduction. He can wrestle, he's got style and profile, he's got a class." Weeks later, Ole Anderson's days as a horseman came to an end with the group beatdown, before we threw him into a broom closet. I was no longer an associate. I was one of the Four Horsemen. Everything about me was about to get a makeover. When you become part of a wrestling royalty, you need to look and act the part. Jim Crockett Promotions' main booker and wrestler in his own right, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, began thinking of what my something extra would be. I was backstage with Dusty, the other horseman, and JJ, before the Saturday night taping. What can Lex do to get the crowd on their feet? How about a signature move? I'm not convinced that he needs one, Dusty said. He should simply stick with power moves, lots of body slams and clotheslines, things that showcase his body. Suddenly, a technician threw out an idea. How about a backbreaker? It would be a great way to show off his body, especially his abs and legs, as well as his overall strength. I was open to anything. So the technician gave me a quick run through on how the move was supposed to be done. We practiced in backstage minutes before heading out to the ring. When the time was right during a match, I would power slam my opponent, then flex my upper body to signal to the crowd that it would become my signature move, the torture rack. While my opponent was still dazed, I'd come up behind him, grab him, and lift him into my shoulders until he submitted. That's it. Dusty slapped me on the back as I headed to the locker room after the match. We all loved it. That's your finish. And it had all come together 5 minutes before showtime. Now, I think another little interesting tidbit that they left out of the biography is something that's like, where did they get the total package? Where did that come from? And he actually explains it in his book. He said, I had a signature move. Now I needed a descriptor. Before one of my interviews as an official member of the Horsemen, Dusty was giving me a pep talk. You need to show a little bit more swag in front of the cameras. The kind of bravado that makes the Horsemen the most loved and hated group of all, he said. Exude confidence. Let everybody know that you have the brains, the brawn, and the professional football pedigree. You're the total package. The total package. Everyone loved the way it sounded, and we tossed it around to the announcers to include in the introduction. Then he says in parentheses, I later took on an attorney's advice and trademarked Lex Luger in the total package to maintain creative control. So Dusty Rhodes came up with the total package. We all know that Dusty is very creative. So this feels like something that Dusty probably would have dreamed up. It's a total package, baby. The American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. You see this young man, Lex Luger, with all his muscles and ain't a brain inside of his head, but the young man going somewhere. As long as you listen to me, kid, you'll be all right. Now, in the biography, I'm glad they mentioned this because this was really good. And I don't think that Lex talked too much about this in his book. But there was a lot of people jealous of Lex Luger because he was getting super pushed. The guy looked like $1 million, even though he didn't have a lick of experience. So when in the biography, when Barry Windham says that the company was babysitting Luger, I thought that was phenomenal. And considering Barry Windham had a tough time, because he remember, I'm pretty sure most of y'all don't know this. He's the son of Blackjack Mulligan. And he would wrestle as Blackjack Mulligan Jr., which has got to be quite a bit of an albatross around a young man's neck. So if you go back to like Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, you will see Blackjack Mulligan Jr., which is not good. All right, let's just be honest, it's not good. So I can see why, at this point, Barry Windham would have had several years of experience because, he started in like 1980 or 1981. And this would have been the late 80s where Luger is coming in and getting the super push. So, yeah, he's got a bit of an attitude. And they mention that he gets the first ever guaranteed contract from Jim Crockett Promotions. Now, he talked about this in the book, too. And I thought this was very interesting, so I'm going to read you a bit of these pieces of this. So he says, quote, I never signed any formal contract with Jim Crockett Promotions. My paycheck was $2,000 or $3,000 a week, comparable with most wrestlers' main event earnings at the time. Wrestlers had always worked under unilateral contracts, agreements with no specific money stipulated. It was a long-standing practice for promoters to pay guys according to what they appeared on the card. The more popular and higher profile you were, the later your name appeared on the card and the more money you made. The WWF was no different. Vince McMahon used unilateral contracts too, paying his performers at his discretion based on card placement. But things suddenly changed for me after I returned from a wrestling event in Las Vegas. There, I had bumped into Vince McMahon at the gym. I had never met him before, but I certainly knew who he was. We exchanged pleasantries and talked for 5 minutes about our families. Wrestling was never mentioned. But that's not the message that got back to Jim Crockett. Little did I know how much gossip dominated professional wrestling at the time. In parentheses, I shall add, it still does. He says, and what a flurry my conversation with Crockett's rival would cause. I overheard some whispers that Jim Crockett was seriously concerned because I'd been seen with Vince. As soon as I got back to Charlotte, I was called to Jim's office. This is where they start talking about the contract. They want to sign him to a contract as a member of the Four Horsemen. So he says, he skimmed through the pages. I didn't see any mention of money. I was concerned about being locked into a contract without that important detail in writing. So I spoke up. And he says, I don't see any kind of compensation mentioned here. Jim Crockett responded, we don't do that. Lex Luger said, so let me get this straight. I signed with you. You own my rights. I can't wrestle anywhere else. But there's no money stipulated. No minimum guarantee. Nothing. He leaned forward and looked at me in a while. I don't mean to be ungrateful, Mr. Crockett. You've given me a great opportunity, but this just doesn't seem right. I need to be sure that I can provide for my family. Crockett responded, what do you think you should be making? Lex Luger responded, I like to be able to make what Ric Flair or Dusty Rhodes makes if I'm able to reach their level of popularity. And I'm producing. I expect you to pay me as much as you pay them. Crockett says, well, give me a figure that you consider to be fair. And then he says, I'll have to think about that. I like to confer with my attorney. He tells Jim Crockett, for starters, I want a minimum guarantee. Second, I don't know how much that should be, so talk to my lawyers. And this is a guy who I'm pretty sure at this point had about almost 2 years in the business. Now, when you talk to a lot of these wrestling journalists and they act like these wrestlers are so damn helpless, this is a guy, again, 2 years in the business. All he really did was have a chance conversation with Vince McMahon. And that led Jim Crockett to want to lock him down because he saw something in him, you know? So this was very good. This was awesome. He continues. A week later, I returned with the contract, requesting a guaranteed $350,000 minimum per year, a huge amount of money at the time. Would my bluff pay off? He says, quote, if we had been playing poker, it would have been a very short game. It took Jim Crockett only a matter of seconds to mull it over. Okay, we'll do it. A 3-year deal, giving you a minimum of $350,000 annually. Give us a week to get everything drawn up. Wow. That's crazy. But there's more. He said, at the time, Rick was the only horseman who flew first class. Arn, Tully, JJ, and I always sat in coach. I thought it sent the wrong message to the fans and sullied the image of the horsemen as athletes, accustomed to only the finer things in life. I tapped my inner lawyer and presented my case. The horsemen have it to maintain the image of opulence that's been created. Fans are everywhere, including the airport. When a plane lands, how would it look for us to be some of the last passengers to get off instead of the first? I think it's bad PR. That's tremendous. That is tremendous. Lex Luger he was smart enough to turn the gimmick against the promoter. Oh, you told us that we was rich and famous, but we not living rich and famous. What are you going to do, Jim Crockett? You should make us look rich and famous, baby. What's going on? Now, of course, Vince McMahon did this to Ted DiBiase as well. And we know it was Vince's idea on this one, where Vince would cover all of Ted's expenses and, pay first class for him and all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't exactly unprecedented, but I think this was before the $1 Million Man character was created. So this was crazy. He basically has treated Jim Crockett like an ATM, right? Now, if you're wondering why Jim Crockett went out of business, come on. Lex Luger was not drawn to enough, at least at this time. This is 1988, maybe, to him being paid $350,000 and for you to fly him first class everywhere. That's just nutty. And Jim Crockett went for it. He was okay with this. Absolutely insane. In the biography, Lex Luger says basically that he was inspired by having to sign football contracts. Like when he played football, he was given a minimum amount of money for a set amount of time, and he expected the same thing in wrestling. So They spent some time with pretty much every talking head in the biography, calling him selfish and saying he was arrogant and cocky and he should have thought more about other people and not so much about himself. I don't know what any of that meant, especially considering, I get it. This is a guy who was juicing the company at this point. But, he's got his own kids. He's got his own mouth to feed. At this point, the guy's 30, seemingly. I know he said that he was 27 when he started wrestling, which is kind of late. It was not quite DDP, when he was 35, but 27 is kind of late. But, with the athletic background, I'm pretty sure they didn't mind it too much. Now, Lex talks in his book pretty much about being very cocky and a little overconfident, and he talks about Sting. Sting actually wanted to talk to him about his workout regimen because everybody talks about Lex Luger's body. There can be no more of an objectified male than Lex Luger. And Sting wants to know how the hell did he get in great shape. Now, Sting is a bodybuilder. This is not mentioned in the biography. It's also not mentioned in the book, but this is Sting's thing. Sting is a body guy, so he sees another body guy and he's like, wait, how the hell did he do that? So he goes over to Lex and asks Lex about his workouts and what he eats and this kind of stuff. And this part is in the biography. He says, quote, "Stolus and peanut M&Ms. I responded to him sarcastically, not even bothering to look at him. I did glance up when I heard him turn and walk away. He was shaking his head. Over the next few months, we started running into each other everywhere. At house shows, in the same hotels, at breakfast in the morning, at the gym working out. Finally, we started having breakfast and going to the gym together. As we got to know each other and became traveling partners, we found out how much we had in common. It was the beginning of a profound, deep relationship." Of course, him and Sting will become best of buds. They're still best of buds today, which is awesome. They're like, I would say Benoit and Eddie Guerrero, except for neither one of them are dead. So Hall and Nash, Al Snow and Mick Foley, Sting and Lex Luger, the good buddies. Also, I think the most successful of the good buddy system. The Austin and Pillman thing didn't work out quite well either. According to Jim Cornette, it took 5 years, but Lex Luger is finally starting to get it. And he's becoming actually a good wrestler from working with Ric Flair and working with all these other guys in the territories. But things are getting a little bit difficult. Things are getting a little sticky. Why? Well, money, of course. In the book, he says, quote, the feud between Rick and me generated big money for Crockett Promotions, and they were hoping it would be enough to keep the company solvent. But by the end of 1988, Crockett was still struggling financially and was behind on paying me my guarantee. I felt like I needed to look at my options. After talking to my attorney, I contacted Vince McMahon and told him we felt Jim Crockett was in breach of contract. Vince invited me to his house for a secret meeting. I flew to Greenwich, and we spent the entire morning together. It was a great meeting. Vince made us tuna fish sandwiches for lunch, and one of my favorites. His parting words were, "I love to have you. Let's allow this to play out a little bit more, not only for my company's sake, but for your benefit too." So this leads to Lex Luger basically finagling his way out of Jim Crockett Promotions to sign with the WBF, the World Bodybuilding Federation, which I think this is probably the most World Bodybuilding Federation footage I've ever seen, which was in this documentary, because I don't remember watching WBF body slams as a kid. I don't remember that at all. But I remember seeing Vince McMahon say that this is sports entertainment. I was like, man, to be rich and cocky like Vince, where you just say, you know what? I'm going to start me a bodybuilding league. It's like nobody likes bodybuilding as much as, it's like a small number of people in the world who even cares about bodybuilding. Like this, I don't think there's enough people that care about bodybuilding for you to make a whole new league and sink millions of dollars into it. But, Vince has his whims. And when you're rich and you got an idea, just go for it. I don't see why you wouldn't. But here's the pitch that he gave to Vince. He says, and I quote, I threw out an idea to Vince. What do you think about signing me to a 1-year WBF bodybuilding contract if I can get out of the last year of my WCW wrestling contract? I was currently planning to sit down with my current employer to ask for a year off. I'll tell them I won't be wrestling anywhere for a year, but may possibly explore other opportunities. If they agree, I can be a bodybuilder for you and then segue into wrestling the following year. Vince was intrigued by my proposal and said he'd get back to me. My next meeting was with WCW front office, where I made a confession. Quote, I've been going hard for 6 years. I'm burned out and need a year off to rest and be with my family. That was certainly true, and since I suspected the company was looking for more places to save money, I thought it could be a win-win situation. So I wasn't surprised when they responded, we can't pay you if you aren't working wrestling for us. He says, that's okay. I might be looking into some other opportunities over the next year, but wrestling will definitely not be one of them. He says, I didn't elaborate. I let them think that whatever they wanted. They accepted my offer, and we both agreed to terms. Meanwhile, Vince got back to me. He agreed to sign me to a 1-year WBF contract, assuring me he would take care of me financially. It was a sweet deal. So, he talked his way out of WCW to join the World Bodybuilding Federation for 1 year, which gave Vince an opportunity to invest a full year into Lex Luger and to make him the face of the World Bodybuilding Federation, which, of course, that also flopped too. Jesus H. Christ, Vince. What the hell? So now Lex is in the WWF where, things start to heat up. Now, in both in the documentary and in the book, they talk about Vince's vision of what he saw for Lex Luger. He said, and I quote, the total package was going to be rewrapped, but Vince wanted a unique twist to my character. Everybody knows you as Lex Luger, the total package. But let's suggest them thinking of you as the narcissist, Vince excitedly explained. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was known for his physical beauty. One day, when Narcissus passed a pool of water, he was drawn to his own reflection and became so enamored with it, he wouldn't leave. A marketing and character development genius, Vince thought the self-worship angle was an ideal fit for me, especially since I was always striving for the perfect body in real life. I was training steroid-free for the unveiling and my debut because of the stringent mandatory drug testing that was taking place for all the wrestlers in the WWF. I was pleasantly surprised that I could look as good as I did without steroids, so I didn't take any during my tenure at the WWF. It's also that Vince was, under investigation for steroids. And how weird is it that, you went to Bret Hart and you went to Yoko because you wanted to get away from the steroid guys, the Warriors and the Hogans. And then you find Lex Luger, guy who is absolutely shredded, who of course had been on steroids since he was like in high school, I think. So, now all of a sudden he's going to be a choir boy. No more steroids. Okay, dokie, if you say so. Bruce Pritchett was the guy in the documentary talking about narcissists, which was very interesting, and I liked it, but they talked a little bit also in the documentary about his motorcycle accident, and basically he had tore his arm up in the motorcycle accident, and this is where he got the metal plate in his arm, and he didn't mention whether he was on drugs or not, or whether it was just a freak accident. I don't remember what it was in the biography, in the book rather, because I didn't, take notes on that one. But that metal plate in the arm, which Vince chose to use as a piece of his character, when he would run and bang that arm across people's heads, which of course as a kid I didn't get it, but it makes perfect sense now. So they showed some really good footage from his WWF days in this part of the documentary. It made it absolutely must see. We got to see Vince McMahon in the ring with the narcissist mirrors, like doing the entrance and kind of working through the entrance. It was tremendous. Like, you see Vince there with the mirrors and everything. It's so fucking cool. And you can see how hands-on he was into molding and shaping these ridiculous characters that he came up with. It's like, I'm not even upset that at the narcissist after seeing how, Vince was like, this is what he wanted. And to hear people talk about Lex, especially in his biography, it kind of felt like this is how Lex should be. Like he should have been the narcissist. Like it should have just stuck with that. So Lex wrote in his book, the build-up crescendoed when I entered the arena for the pre-match instruction at WrestleMania 9, held at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas on April the 4th, 1993. I had done a few house shows prior to that, but this was the event where most of the wrestling fans would watch me perform in the WWF for the first time. I walked to the ring, flaunting my self-indulgent attitude, accompanied by my beautiful showgirls, who held up large mirrors for me to admire myself. My entrance was much more dramatic than my opponent's, Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig. Curt was renowned as a great worker and was one of the very best tacticians and technicians in all of wrestling. I was thrilled they'd chosen him to work with me at WrestleMania. It was hard for anybody to have a bad match with him because he could bring out the best in anybody, just like Ric Flair. I wasn't considered a premier worker. I had always followed Matsuda's advice, keep it simple. I was best known for simply flexing my muscles and showing off my sculpted physique, so the pairing seemed like a great idea. The two of us had talked in advance about how we were going to structure the match and were confident that everything had been covered. As the match began, I was startled when Curt and I locked up and he said, "What are we doing?" "What do you mean, what are we doing?" I shot back, the panic building in my voice. "Aren't you the one leading this match?" I'm drawing a blank. "Oh no, what are we going to do?" Somehow we managed to get through this match with me leading. As you can imagine, it wasn't exactly one of my best matches, or even one of the better ones on the card. So I was glad when it was over. Now, they tell somebody a lot of one of the interesting stories that people has always told is how obsessive Lex Luger was about details. So they used one of the interesting ribs that people have claimed that Mr. Perfect played on Lex Luger is he kept taking the tassels off of his tights, and that he would remove tassels from his tights, and it would just make Lex absolutely insane because it was destroying his look. And that would have been something that would have been a nice little lift up from, to either put it in the biography or put it in the book, how Curt was constantly playing ribs. And this felt like a rib, but at the same time, you never really know because Hennig was on some stuff too, So it's unfortunate, but that's just the case. He's one of those party animal guys. So Lex writes in the book, quote, "Over the next few months, my career as the narcissist was going well. Fans reacted enthusiastically wherever I went. In June, Vince asked me to come to his office in WWF headquarters. I didn't know what was up. It was highly unusual for him to pull a wrestler off the road for a meeting. That's when he surprised me with a new storyline. I was going to be one of the organization's star babyfaces, a coveted position. My days as a heel were over. I would soon be revealed as the All-American, the WWF's most beloved patriot, introduced at an exhibition on board the USS Intrepid." So what this did, when this was perfect, this was perfect. The USS Intrepid, this angle was great. Now, this is simple. It's a really, really simple old school wrestling thing. It is a body slam challenge. Pretty much every giant from Andre to Big John Studd to numerous others, King Kong Bundy, everybody has done a body slam challenge. If you're a big guy, you're daring somebody to come in there and slam you. It's literally that simple. The only difference is that they tinged it with the anti-American stuff with Yokozuna. So this was tremendous. And one thing that I loved about this this USS Intrepid thing is Vince on commentary saying that this is the last chance of America. This is the last chance of America. America only got one more chance. And it's Lex Luger, who came in on a helicopter. Oh, if you thought he wasn't going to do it, how are you going to come in on a helicopter and not slam him? That's what I want to know. If you come in on a helicopter and you don't slam him, what happens now? If you can't tell that I love this hokey shit, this is great. This is fantastic. Lex Luger says in the book, Yoko was massive, but I always called him the dancing bear because he was so incredibly nimble for a man his size. He was undoubtedly the most talented big man in the business. Because of his immense girth, it was difficult to reach and grab Yoko, let alone slam him. He had to help you, of course, but even then, picking Yoko up required coordination and perfect timing. It was imperative that your feet were set correctly to provide a strong foundation for him to come up on you so that you could turn him. It was required really powerful legs, or he'd run completely over you and make you an ink spot on the mat. Yoko and I had rehearsed everything about a week earlier at WWF's nearby headquarters in Connecticut. I had been in my running shoes that afternoon. Now I was in cowboy boots. The boots certainly added to my look, but I knew immediately there would be problems. As soon as I slid into the ring, I began to lose my footing. When we were nose to nose, I began to panic. Yoko, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to do it. I feel like I'm on ice skates in these boots. I've got no footing. No problem, brother, he said calmly. I got you. Just do your best to stay on your feet. As scripted beforehand, he took a swing at me. I ducked under it, and before countering with several powerful blows, Yoko rebounded, as he was supposed to do, tossing me into a turnbuckle. As he charged me in an attempt to squash me in the turnbuckle, I was supposed to jump out of the way at the last second. When I moved, Yokozuna would hit the turnbuckle and then stagger back out, facing me so that I could body slam him. Yoko slowed up enough as he bounced off the turnbuckle to avoid running me over before performing an acrobatic turn in midair that gave me the footing I needed. In essence, he sort of body slammed himself. That's amazing. That should tell you how really good Yoko was. I'm still not a fan. I still wasn't a fan. I was never a big fan of Yokozuna. Just not a guy I revisit when it comes to my love of the new generation era. Yoko doesn't really fit the bill. But I loved all of this. This is simple as it gets. This is pure pro wrestling. You got a big guy, got a smaller guy. You tell the story, big guy, small guy. But the small guy in this situation is incredibly muscular. The big guy, fat. So now you're looking at one guy who looks like he should be able to beat your ass in a fight. And the other guy, hey, he might be big, but you're worried about his stamina. And you're kind of like, hey, maybe the little guy got a chance. And maybe the little guy can hang in there. Now, in the documentary, they did a really great job of talking about the Lex Express, because they know that's what everybody wanted to know about. So the idea for the Lex Express, which comes from the biography, where Bruce Pritchett talked about George Bush, who got on the train to campaign across America. And since Vince, of course, was, pretty staunch New York Republican, he saw George Bush and said, aha, God damn it, I got it, pal. Instead of putting him on a train, we're going to put him on a bus. And so they put Lex Luger up on the bus, the Lex Express, to go across country to campaign for a match for the WWF Championship against Yokozuna. Yokozuna's trying to duck him. He body slammed him. Now, the general idea of this thing is that Lex Luger is now supposed to be a blue-collar man of the people. He's supposed to be just like you and me. He's supposed to be a hero for us to replace Hulk Hogan, who walked out on us. Unfortunately, Lex Luger is not that guy. He's not. He's used to the finer things in life. So they say Lex Luger lived on the bus for about a week before he started to complain. He started to whine, and they showed awesome video of Lex just being an absolute diva. It was as bad as the Ultimate Warrior episode. Like, if you saw the Ultimate Warrior stuff and he had to apologize to that kid and he was like, fuck, what am I doing here? And he was just getting real frustrated and Vince was talking him through it. It was similar with Lex Luger. You see Lex Luger at autograph signings and he's yelling at fans, some guys like, Lex, you're going to be the future. You're going to be the franchise. And Lex is like, we'll see about that. I don't know about that one. Like, God, like, buy into it. Lex is doing photo shoots and he's complaining about his food preps and how he can't get chicken and he's hungry and he gets angry when he gets hangry when he's hungry and all this diva shit. And Bruce said, look, he rode on the bus for a week with Lex. And it became pretty clear at the end of that week, Lex wasn't going to make it. And I'm telling you, this footage is worth everything. That footage alone is worth sitting through this entire episode. It was fantastic how they kind of buried Lex right here. You started to see why they didn't give Lex the belt. Like for years and years and years, they just said, oh, Lex didn't get over. That was the whole thing. Oh, Lex just didn't get over as a babyface. So, like that didn't really jive well with me that Lex never got over. Because I was like a kid watching this and I was kind of like hoping Lex Luger would win the title. The people went ape shit when he won by count out against Yokozuna. He was kind of over and people wanted to see him be the champion. The problem is he didn't fit the character that Vince wanted him to fit. And he wasn't the guy. He complained too much. He whined too much. And when you see that stuff, you see like, this never would have worked. It might have worked long enough for him to get the belt. And once he got the belt, it would have been something completely different. But Vince, pulling back at SummerSlam, basically he wasn't getting it at all at that point. It seemed like they had essentially ruined it. Right then and there, and Vince was just kind of like, okay, we're just going to kick the can down the road. Hopefully he'll turn his attitude around. And he didn't. And so the answer to the question of why Lex Luger didn't win the title at SummerSlam or WrestleMania wasn't that, he secretly told somebody in a bar about it or anything like that. It's just that Lex Luger was a douchebag who Vince didn't think he could carry the character. He didn't think he could carry the gimmick. His attitude was too shitty. And he pulled the plug. That's crazy. That's the simplest explanation. Vince wanted a top babyface. Lex Luger can't get through a promo. That scene where Vince is trying to talk Lex through this promo, that absolutely had my head in my hands. I was just like, I cannot believe this guy was so close to being not just the WWE champion, but the top wrestler in the entire business. And they had spent all this money getting this guy over. They paid for a bus. This is 1993, 1994. This company is broke at this time. Vince doesn't have a lot of money. He just got sued for, he just got, he got sued by the Ring Boy scandal. He had just gone through steroid trial. Business is down. He's spending tons and tons and tons of money on Lex Luger. And Lex Luger is out there complaining that he lost 10 pounds of good muscle because he couldn't eat his chicken breast when he needed to. What the fuck? I mean, it is the absolute most insane stuff. Like, this was worth the price of admission. So, the only good argument Lex had through this whole thing is that he was away from his family a lot, which is true. He had to go on a bus trip across the United States. He was going to an Arby's for some reason. Just posted up at Arby's, shaking hands and kissing babies. But here's what Lex had to say about the Lex Express. I met lots of moms, dads, and kids, fans of all ages, when the Lex Express bus rolled for the 6-week cross-country promotion. After the exhibition in July, Vince had said to me, if I put the world title on you, I'm not sure if it'll be SummerSlam or next year's WrestleMania at Madison Square Garden. I wasn't concerned about whether or not I was getting the heavyweight title. That was Vince's decision, not mine. As always, I trusted his instincts. I knew that this promotional tour was a way to give a big push for an individual character leading up to a pay-per-view main event. There were 3 of us riding down a highway together, a driver, a publicist, and me. We pulled out of the WWF's headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, and began the whirlwind trip. At the first stop in Danbury, Connecticut, we met 8,000 fans waiting for my autograph at Meeker's hardware store. a historical landmark. 4 hours later, I had to stop signing and just shake the rest of the hands of the fans so we could head to Boston. It was nonstop from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. in the city after city, small and large. The publicists and others had done their jobs well in relatively short notice to give me the most exposure on a variety of media. In the early mornings, I'd be featured on radio talk shows, do local TV shows, fit in 2 autograph signings a day at large stores or other venues, stop at local landmarks for photo ops, make guest appearances on early evening news shows, do a segment with the weather guys, and if I had any energy left, I try to hit the gym and work out too. I didn't travel with any security. We were on our own. I would catch a nap on the bus when I could, and we would stay at hotels to get some needed sleep before going hard the next day. So you could tell, now being at the top of the WWE, and I talked to somebody on Twitter about this, not everybody is built for this level of fame. You know, this is a completely new ball game. Vince is really pushing this. He's got autograph signings in toy stores and hardware stores, and he's really putting the gas behind Lex. And it's burnt Lex out. He's burnt out. He only had to do it for 6 weeks. He was burnt out. You know, there was a lot of talk of a certain mouthy AEW wrestler who became WWE champion, was WWE champion for 400 days, and how he didn't really like the schedule and he complained a lot. Because when you are at the top of this profession, you're expected to do all of this stuff. Like, this is the stuff John Cena did. This is the stuff that Hulk Hogan did. Not everybody is built for this. This is Lex Luger cracked at this part. And this is the part that is most important events. In the biography, Lex talks about the amount of responsibility, and he says, I thought I could make it. He said, I thought I could make it. So Bruce Pritchett says this was, the point of this was to give the average guy an opportunity to meet a WWE superstar in person in a more intimate setting. You know, instead of a big, you know, contracts, I mean, not big contract, but like a big meet and greet. It would be like, you know, he comes to your town. There was a comment made in one of the magazine articles I probably read to you guys before, where they talked about rock stars, and they says that certain rock stars don't come to small towns, but WWE superstars do. And that, you know, Hulk Hogan would, you know, come from the TV screen into your neighborhood. And that's what they loved about the WWF. And that's what they got other people to love about it, is that, you know, the Rolling Stones doesn't come to your high school gym, but Hulk Hogan might, you know, and that's kind of what they built the brand on. So Luger is not being asked to do anything that Hogan didn't actually have to do, and that Bret Hart probably didn't have to do. Difference is he wasn't good at it. And furthermore, he didn't really like people. So they talked again, Bruce Pritchett and Nash and Bret Hart basically said, look, Lex Luger's not a people person. Might be a nice guy when you get to know him, but he's got a bit of a prickly personality. You know, it takes a while to get there. And I was like, wow, just the thought of, you know, this guy getting so close that it's pretty wild to think about it when you really consider that Lex Luger was earmarked to be the man. So Lex, of course, doesn't win the title. SummerSlam 93. We all kind of sit back and laugh at it now that, you know, there was this big celebration, even though he didn't win the title. In the book, he says that he basically doesn't remember the match with Yokozuna because Yokozuna's leg hit him in the head from one of the leg drops, and it kind of crushed his skull a little bit, and he doesn't really remember it that much. When it comes to WrestleMania 10, he says that he was supposed to go into a feud with Kurt Hennig as the heel referee, but Kurt and the WWF couldn't come to an agreement on a contract, so that's why he ended up leaving. Now, Gerald Briscoe in the biography starts talking about the negative feedback that he's getting. He said basically there was no positive feedback from Lex Luger or anything on his matches or anything about his attitude, that he just was not working out. It was becoming more and more negative. And Bret Hart says, look, we just had to understand that this guy just wasn't a good fit for the WWF. And that just kind of makes a lot of sense to me. Now, I don't want to keep you guys for too much longer, so we're going to skip a lot of the WCW stuff and go straight to the Elizabeth stuff, because I think this is the part that everybody was kind of sitting back waiting for. Like, how are they going to talk about what happened with Liz? And in the biography, they basically told the story pretty much straight up. That Luger never really considered himself a guy who was going to get involved with somebody that he worked with. But since him and Liz had become pretty close backstage and started working together on screen, things sort of developed from there. So he talks about the rebirth of the total package, when he would drop the name Lex Luger and just start going by the total package. He says, I like the tearaway costume, especially since it would give me the opportunity to again showcase my body, this time as a heel. Why don't we have one of the girls tear off your costume, somebody said. Yeah, why not have Miss Elizabeth do it, suggested one of the bookers. Having Elizabeth Hulett, who was considered the great first lady of wrestling, as my valet, seemed to work for everyone. She had started in the business in the WWF in 1985, so she had a long history of appeal to fans. To create hype for the fall premiere, Elizabeth and I filmed at a local funeral home, with me laying in an open casket and her dressed in black, mourning my death. Many fans have asked whether it was creepy being in a casket, but to be honest, it didn't bother me at all. On September 27, 1999, at the Phillips Arena in Atlanta, Elizabeth walked on stage dressed in black trench coat and mourning veil. Then, out of the shadows, I appeared back from the grave. It was the rebirth of Lex Luger. Because of this new storyline, I was now around Elizabeth more often. As can happen in any working relationship, the more time you spend with someone who has the same background and interests as you do, the more you get to know each other and can begin to enjoy each other's company. So, there it is. He says, not long afterward, I found myself involved in a full-blown extramarital relationship with Elizabeth, something I had vowed would never happen to me. I had always thought that messing around with someone at work was a toxic situation. So much for that self-declaration. So, in the biography, we learned that Elizabeth was married to someone else. She had been divorced from Randy for a while now. And Lex Luger, of course, is married to his wife, Peggy. He has 2 children at this point. But him and Elizabeth are sneaking off and seeing one another. Elizabeth at one point lived in, I believe, in Tampa, and he lived in Atlanta. So they were only really hooking up when they were on tour together. But then at one point, Elizabeth moved to Atlanta. So he says, quote, I'm a happily married man, I'd say. We work out together, but no, we didn't sleep together. We were strictly professional. It should have been a bit red flag to me when Elizabeth told me that she was moving to Atlanta. My good friend, Scotty Steiner, immediately saw where this was headed. That ain't cool that she's moving to Atlanta, he cautioned me. She got her eyes set on you, buddy. She wants to break up your family. That's going to be a disaster for you. And ain't nobody ever accused Scott Steiner for being a liar, right? You can say a lot of things about Scott Steiner. I never heard anybody say that Scott Steiner was a liar. So essentially that's what ended up happening. He ended up getting busted, get caught with Elizabeth. And it was a hell of a story. So he tells a couple of stories of Elizabeth. Of course, again, he's supposed to be trying to be sneaky. He says, sometimes after my midday workout, when I knew Brian, his son, was at school, Elizabeth would stop over at the apartment and we'd catch a buzz together before eating. One afternoon, I heard Brian's key in the door and my heart raced. Why is he home early? I scrambled and rushed Elizabeth into the closet in the spare bedroom where I slept. I tried to act nonchalant until Brian told me that he didn't have practice, so he was home for the rest of the day. Oh no. To calm my nerves, I started catching a light buzz. If worse comes to worse, Elizabeth will have to stay in the closet until Brian goes to bed. That's what he wrote. Later, he wrote, February 14th, 2002 was a day that would haunt me for years to come. Elizabeth had asked me for a ride to the nearby Range Rover dealership to drop her car off for some work. Before we left, she surprised me with Valentine's gifts. I left them sitting on the kitchen table, thinking that I would stash them when I got back in a few minutes. Brian was at school, and Peggy and Lauren, his daughter, never stopped by the apartment during the day, so it seemed safe. Unbeknownst to me, when I was down the street with Elizabeth, Peggy stopped by the apartment with a surprise for Brian and me, a special Valentine's dinner she had prepared for us. Instead, she was the one who was surprised. Elizabeth's purse and her gifts to me were in plain sight on the table. So he's busted. And this was one of the few times the two of them kind of got busted. And it was pretty much over. Now, she took him back, and he just kept doing the same thing over and over again. This is something that, was in the biography, that it took a couple of times before Peggy finally left him and took the kids. But it got pretty ugly, and that's real sad. And Miss Elizabeth being shuffled in the closet is pretty wild shit for somebody like me. Now, let's get into, some of the issues that him and Elizabeth had, where they didn't go into any real detail about his arrest for domestic violence. In the biography, they basically said that he was doing drugs, him and Elizabeth, they were doing a lot of drugs, and he got arrested for domestic violence because he got caught yelling at Elizabeth in public, and they were both intoxicated, and somebody had to go to jail. Which is technically true. Sometimes when, some of these states have these domestic abuse laws where, the husband and the wife or the boyfriend and the girlfriend get into an argument, somebody's got to go to jail. And most of the time it's going to be the man. But this is what he wrote in the book about this. He said, quote, the previous 6 months, there had been signs of Elizabeth increasing the amounts she needed for a buzz. But to be quite honest, I was too focused on myself to think of what was happening to her. As we talked, her friend's concern brought some things to light. Lex, did you ever notice how accidental prone Elizabeth has gotten lately? Yeah, but she always blames it on Sadie. Sadie jerked the leash when they were on a walk and pulled her down. Sadie was Elizabeth's German Shepherd. After talking about the situation, Elizabeth's friend and I believed that the drugs and alcohol were the more likely culprits. As I reflected on it, I knew she wasn't fine. She was coming into the gym less and less often, saying she didn't feel well. That wasn't like her. She's not taking care of herself, I thought. Although I thought she was being a busybody, I told Elizabeth's friend that I would talk to her about it. When I next saw Elizabeth, I said, I think maybe we need to clean it up a little more, maybe cut back on the alcohol and the pills. And she nodded in agreement. It says, and I quote, I had a fenced-in yard. The two dogs loved playing with each other. This would be Elizabeth's dog and his son's dog. He says, one evening when Elizabeth and I were catching a buzz, she announced that she wanted to take the dogs for a walk. She enjoyed walking the dogs, so she ignored my comments about taking them out back and began leashing them. I walked out into the garage to see them off with no intention of going along. About 10 feet down the driveway, the two dogs began ramping after one another, and their leashes wrapped around Elizabeth's legs. She became hog-tied and fell down on the driveway hard, hurting her arm and shoulder and scraping her face underneath the right eye. It all happened in an instant. When I ran over to help her, she insisted that she was fine. When we went inside and put the bag of ice on her eye, she was concerned about the scrape, so I suggested we put in some Neosporin on it. A few days later, we had both gotten buzzed before going to our favorite pizza place to pick up some dinner. When we got home and I pulled into the garage, Elizabeth got out of the Porsche with the pizza box still on her lap, lost her footing and stumbled. The pizza box flipped open and the extra large pizza, loaded with everything, went all over the inside of the car. She got up and headed inside the house. I was definitely upset. Hey, we need to clean this up now. You clean it up, she responded. When she headed for the door that led back into the house, I blocked her way. We continued to argue, and Elizabeth kept trying to get past me into the house. As our voices grew louder, a neighbor called the police. We were both in the house when several squad cars pulled up. I opened the door and one officer asked me to wait outside while he talked to Elizabeth. I didn't think much of it, standing outside chatting with the other policemen. A few minutes later, the officer came back through the door. Lex, you're under arrest for domestic abuse. What? I was stunned. I had never laid a hand on a woman in my life. I was read my rights and taken to Cobb County Jail. I was allowed my one phone call, which made to my lawyer at 5 a.m. on Easter morning. He come down to the station, posted bond, and bailed me out. It was then that I learned the details of the charge. The arresting officer had seen Elizabeth's black eye and the abrasion on her cheek and believed that I had harmed her. Elizabeth had emphatically insisted that I had never touched her, and she was very upset that the officer had arrested me. The charges were eventually dropped, and at least for a few weeks, everything was back to normal. So, it's up to you whether you want to believe this story or not. I mean, she tripped and fell is one of the oldest excuses in the book. I mean, it is what it is. In the biography, he says that he got arrested because they got into an argument. In the book, he tells this whole story about Elizabeth being tripped by the dogs and falling and hitting her face and everything. So, believe what you want. That's your opinion, I guess. So, clearly, we're going to talk about Elizabeth dying. And in the biography, he kind of told the story pretty straight up. They went and got some food. She put hers in the microwave. He took hers out, brought it to her, and he went and warmed his up. And while he was at the microwave, she essentially passed away. To give you a little bit more color on this, it goes like this. Lex wrote in the book, I'm going to run over to Blockbuster and grab some movies, I said, ready to relax for the evening. To be honest, I was ready to get buzzed myself, then enjoy one of my favorite Boston market meals, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. When I got back to Blockbuster, I popped in an Arnold Schwarzenegger action flick. We partied with a few pills and cocktails, but kept it light. I was talking about Brian and the Scouts, and Elizabeth was happy that I had an opportunity to be there. I was really into the movie, but it did nothing I didn't notice that Elizabeth kept dozing on and off. She'd wake up during loud action scenes, then close her eyes again. I didn't think too much of it since it was late. I figured she was really tired. By the time the movie was over, I was starving and decided it was time to microwave our meatloaf and potatoes. Elizabeth was hungry as well, so she got up from the couch and walked over to the microwave to help. Go ahead and sit down, I said. I'll bring it over to you. I took her plate over to her on a tray, then sat down on the couch and started digging into my dinner. She had taken a few bites of food, then the next moment I looked over, her head was rolled back as if she were sleeping. Hey Liz, wake up, I said. Your food's getting cold. She didn't answer or move. I said a little bit louder, Hey Liz, let's eat. There was no response. I set my tray aside, walked over and kneeled down in front of her. Moving the tray off of her, I nudged her and she didn't move. Man, she's really out. I nudged her once again on her shoulder. She made a gurgling noise. Then some saliva came out of her mouth, but she didn't open her eyes. Something's not right. When she didn't open her eyes, I decided to gently pull her up by her eyelids. I was immediately startled. Her eye was completely dilated. Something was terribly wrong. I couldn't feel it I felt it in my gut. I ran to my phone and dialed 911. Now, they, of course, played the 911 call, which was, I maintained that it was very frightening and that it was horrifying. So I'm pretty sure that was pretty terrible for him, Of course, at this point in time, Elizabeth passes away, and now he's arrested for possession of steroids and selling drugs. Now, that thing is probably where we're going to end this on, because I've had you guys here for long enough. And I'm glad the story ended out very well with him going to jail and the jailhouse chaplain talking him into the arms of his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That was great. But this is how he ended up getting busted for drugs. And this is the last thing we're going to go into. He said, 2 detectives from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation escorted me to their car. Ironically, both of them happened to be regulars at the gym. As we rode from the Marietta police station to the Cobb County Jail, they told me that the steroids had been found in a black gym bag in an upstairs bedroom closet. The vials were wrapped in electrical tape, unopened. The spare bedroom! That's when it hit me. Back in 1998, when I stopped going on the testosterone and HGH therapy prescribed by my endocrinologist, I had stopped using anabolic steroids. But at the time, I had just received a shipment of them from Europe. Since I wasn't using them anymore, I threw the heavily taped package into a zippered pocket in a gym bag, instead of throwing it away. Everything in that separate bedroom closet had been shipped over from Sugarloaf, which is, an apartment complex they used to live in. And I hadn't had time to go through it yet. How ironic that I was being arrested for possessing steroids that I hadn't used in years. By the time we arrived at the jail, I was sleep deprived, exhausted, and totally drained. I was in complete shock, physically, mentally, and emotionally spent when they locked me up. I felt a sense of darkness and despair surrounding me in that cell, something that I had never experienced before. My entire world had come crashing down around me. Before that moment, I always wondered how people could ever think about killing themselves. But now I knew exactly how someone could get to that point. I felt totally alone, nearly smothered by a sense of utter hopelessness. I remember looking around and seeing the privacy wall separating the toilet from the rest of the cell, and contemplated how could I end it all. And in the biography, he talked about standing up on something and basically dive bombing his own head into the ground. I didn't get to the point of the book where he talked about his paralysis. Of course, we know how the story ends. Lex is still alive, yet he's in a wheelchair. He's wheelchair bound. He is now sort of a physical therapist, kind of, where he teaches people how to work out and do all these wonderful things. But it was a hard road getting there. And Lex has a hell of a story. Now, some people are going to still hate Lex for all the Elizabeth stuff. And there's going to be some bitterness there too, from pretty much everybody who loved Elizabeth. But I look at the Elizabeth situation a lot like Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston, for those of you who are very young, used to be the very picture of like a black princess. She was a pop star. She came across like she was the all-American good girl. Like Whitney Houston wouldn't even curse or crush a fly with her shoe, let alone do drugs. But by the time it's like the year 2000 or the year, 2002 or whatever, Whitney Houston is known for doing drugs. And for those of us in the wrestling space, because Elizabeth was out of our public eye, we never really got to see her be so bad. Like Whitney Houston, we got to see her get down bad. But because Elizabeth, we didn't get to see it, it didn't seem as bad. But to me, it's the same thing. It's people who have a public image that clashes with their private image. And the kind of person that she was not the kind of person we saw on TV. The perfect princess that we saw in the WWF with the Randy Macho Man Savage and all that kind of stuff. That's not who she was. And sometimes wrestling fans have a very difficult time separating the character and the person. And the Elizabeth Lex Luger situation is people thinking about it similar to Bobby Brown. And Eric Bischoff talked about it in the biography, where he's kind of like, it's Lex's fault that Elizabeth even got into drugs and alcohol, as if she had no mind of her own. But he said that after he said, well, she was an adult. She made her own bad decisions. And I think that the sooner the wrestling fans kind of get that into their heads that, Elizabeth was an adult with a mind of her own and she made bad decisions. And if they were doing drugs, she's not, 6'5", 250 or whatever. She's a small woman. If they're taking drugs together, especially if they're taking drugs in the same amounts, she's going to die. If she's trying to keep up with him, she's going to die. And that's something that when I was a mentor in college, I used to tell young boys all the time. Like, that was the advantage of me being a little bit older in college, is I would tell young boys, like, you can't go drink for drink with these girls. Especially if you're a football player or something like that, you're 6'2", 6'3", like, brother, she's 5'4". You know, she's 5'4", 140 pounds. You're 220. You know, if you drink the same exact drinks that she drinks, she's going to be way more bombed than you are. You know, you can't do it. And women don't want to hear that either. And that's where women have to take responsibility that they're not men. You know, you don't have the male physique. You don't have the male body, the male size. And small men have this problem too. You know, small men can't eat as much as big men. They can't drink as much. They can't do as much drugs. You know, you're a big dude, you absorb a lot of that stuff. It's still bad for you, but it may take more of it to really knock you down. I mean, doctors know this kind of stuff. Most people should know this kind of stuff. So when a man and a woman are getting together and they're hooking up and they're doing drugs together, they're drinking together or whatever, he should always be a little bit more mindful of the size difference between the two of them. It's not a male-female difference as much as there is a size difference. If he's much bigger than she is, like Lex is much bigger than Liz, and you're doing drugs together, you know, especially if you're doing the same stuff, it's hitting her a lot harder than it's hitting you. You know, and if she starts building up a tolerance, which is what Lex Luger said she was closer to death than he was. So I had to, I think I let go of my dislike for Lex Luger over the death of Liz a long time ago. But there are still a lot of people out there who have not gotten over it. And that's real unfortunate because, you know, it seems that they just don't believe that women have agency. I believe that the woman made her own decisions. And unfortunately, the consequences for those decisions that she died. You know, look at what happened to Lex. Lex, consequences of his decisions that he ended up in prison. He ended up with multiple DUIs. He ended up ruining his life and his legacy. And there is no comeback match for Lex Luger. There is no one last beat. The only thing that he's got, and I believe this is truly the reason why they would do it, is that he said he would try to walk or at least stand for his Hall of Fame induction if he was to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. I truly believe that he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And I believe that it's a good message to send to everyone to have Lex Luger standing at a podium to talk about his life and all the things that he had gone through. Because he was a massive success. And even though he didn't really quite work out the way Vince had wanted him to, he still worked in a different way. He's one of the biggest stars WCW ever produced. He was tremendous. I'm not a huge fan of Lex Luger, but I appreciate the guy. Now, thank you guys for listening. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.